My name's Robin Simcox. I'm the Margaret Thatcher Fellow here at Heritage, and I'm going to be moderating today's discussion between Mary Haybeck and Hassan Hassan. Mary Haybeck is a strategic planner and an expert on military matters, Islam, and extremism. She teaches on al-Qaeda and ISIS at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and at Georgetown. Dr. Haybeck's also a senior fellow with the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Her publications include Knowing the Enemy, Jihadist Ideology, and the War on Terror. Between 2008 and 2009, Haybeck was the special advisor for the strategic planning on the National Security Council staff, also formerly an associate professor in strategic studies at SAIS, and taught American and European military history in Yale's history department. Haybeck received her PhD in history from Yale in 1996. To Mary's left is Hassan Hassan, a senior research fellow at George Washington University's program on extremism. His research and journalism focuses on militant Islam, nonviolent extremism, and geopolitics in the Middle East. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. Hassan is a writer at The Atlantic and co-author of ISIS Inside the Army of Terror with a good friend and former colleague of mine, Michael Weiss, which was a New York Times bestseller. Hassan has written for The Guardian, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, and The New York Times, and has appeared on CNN, BBC, Fox News, MSNBC, and PBS. A native of Eastern Syria, Hassan received a master's degree in international relations from the University of Nottingham. So two eminently qualified people to discuss this subject. I think what we're going to do is have Mary kickstart the conversation. Hassan will respond to some of those comments, then we'll get into the Q&A. So, Mary, take it away.
Thank you. First of all, please forgive me for being late. I just drove here from Ohio and got it within 5 minutes. So, and of course, what did me in was 270, right out here. All right, so first thing I'd like to do is talk about the genesis of this project and how I came to write it. If you take a look at my background, I have a PhD in history, military history specifically, but also strategic thought. And during the 1990s, I got interested in ordinary Islam, not the extremists at all. In fact, strangely enough, it was 9/11. That got me interested in extremism. So I'd spent 2 full years before 9/11 reading about Islam, history, fiqh, all sorts of books, probably 250 or so primary materials, and was teaching myself Arabic when 9/11 occurred. And then I got interested in the extremists for some strange reason. So I was extraordinarily interested in engaging somehow on the big questions that were raised by this horrific attack. First of all, because as a strategic thinker, planner, I understood this was going to cause massive earthquake in U.S. Policy. And in how we interacted with the world. But then secondly, because I was interested in how everyone was talking about the terrorists who carried out the attack. So immediately after 9/11, there were dozens upon dozens of articles. In fact, in December of 2001, I did a Google search on it, and there were 3,000 different mentions of the phrase, "Why do they hate us?" which a lot of people were asking themselves after 9/11. What I was interested in was how people were defining they, because everyone had a different definition for they. There were some people who were talking about the Middle East in general. Why does the Middle East hate us? There were people who were saying specifically Arabs or Arabic speakers, why does Saudi Arabia hate us? Why do the people that everybody called at the time Wahhabis or Salafis, why do they hate us? But everybody had a different definition for they, and it actually wasn't the definition for they that I had in mind, even from my bare 2 years of reading on the subject. I believed that this was a question that needed to be explored, and I immediately set about filling lots of gaps in my knowledge by participating in conferences, writing papers, getting my colleagues to critique my writing, and giving talks on ordinary Islam and these extremists and the contrast between them. But I didn't write anything on it until this paper. So it's taken 17 years to finally write something on a topic I'd been thinking about almost immediately after 9/11. The reason is because I gave a talk all over this town and a lot of other places that I believed kind of filled this expert and knowledge gap that I sensed in the academy. So what was the gap that I saw, at least back in 2001, 2002? What I saw was many of my colleagues were obviously far more expert than I was on the Middle East, had traveled extensively, spoke Arabic, had done lots of interviews and writing on the topic of the Middle East. But all of them, at Yale at least, believed that 9/11 had nothing to do with religion or with the rhetoric that was being used by the attackers to justify this horrific act. On the other hand, those who did understand religion, and that was, there were several religious studies experts who were able to talk to the sort of language, at least, that was being used by the attackers, really hadn't had a previous interest in current events or current affairs. So to them, the questions about religion were sort of esoteric, big thought questions and didn't have much relevance for current events. So there was this gap between those who understood current events and those who understood at least the language that was being used by the attackers. And it quickly devolved into a question of, does this have anything to do with religion at all? Or is it really about something like economics, poverty, lack of opportunity, the despotic regimes that controlled the Middle East at that time, many of which are now gone and replaced by, in some cases, nothing but chaos? Or did it have everything to do with Islam? And in fact, there were these two groups that began to argue with each other, not immediately, but within a year or two after 9/11, about the place of religion, and specifically Islam, in the lives of the people who carried out this attack and in their rhetoric and their ideology. So after spending lots of time being corrected by people far more expert than I am, I finally published a book which needs lots of revision. I've decided, I go back and read it and I'm like, whoa, I don't think that way anymore about that. Whole chapter 2 needs to be revised. And I realized that I really did need to write something on the topic that I've been talking about a lot, but really haven't written anything since 2005, 2006 timeframe. So the paper is hopefully going to fill a kind of gap in policy understanding of an issue that is extraordinarily necessary, in my opinion, for today's debates, the debates that are going on right now in this town. And what it does is it takes a look at ordinary Islam and attempts to show just how extraordinary the extremists are. But it also makes an argument that the language that's being used by the extremists, as well as their lives and the people that they're recruiting, must be taken into consideration. And therefore, we cannot simply dismiss religion as somehow epiphenomenal or having very little to do with the motivations for the people who are carrying out these attacks. Well, what kind of Islam are we actually talking about? Well, if you delve into the writings of the Sharia, so-called Sharia experts put forward by the extremists or by the leadership of ISIS or al-Qaeda, what you see is that they espouse a form of Islam that is so marginal and so different from ordinary Islam that I believe it needs to be called what it really is, and that is a cult. We're dealing with a cult here. It's a conglomeration, basically, of a very specific form of Hanbali Islam, and the form that eventually was called Wahhabism and then later Salafism. But it's a form of Salafism that is different from that espoused by the Saudi government. It's the form known as Sahwa Salafism. That is, in fact, a mixture of Salafism and Qutbi Muslim Brotherhood thought. Because Muhammad Qutb, Sayyid Qutb's brother, traveled to Saudi Arabia after his brother was executed by the Egyptian government. For some reason, he felt the need to leave the country. But when he went to Saudi Arabia, he was granted a professorship at Abdulaziz University, where he immediately set about radicalizing an entire generation of young Saudi men. And amongst those young men that he interacted with personally was Osama bin Laden. In addition, he created a form of Qutbi Islam that is, takes a very extreme vision of Tawheed that's propounded by some Salafis, as well as some other ideas like Hakimiyya and others, and put them together into a new thing known as Sahwa Salafism. But Sahwa Salafism would have gone nowhere without Abdullah Azam, who added in the idea of a global jihad. And it's Abdullah Azam plus Sahwa Salafism that really, in my opinion, equals Jihadi-Salafism, the form of Islam that I believe deserves to be called a cult, and a death cult at that. So the important thing is that this kind of vision about the ideology that's being espoused by both al-Qaeda and ISIS is generally ignored, or was generally ignored, by many experts in the region, as well as many policymakers, as something you really didn't need to take into consideration when thinking about how to combat the extremists. The thought was that's great for the local governments. This gives them some, hooks to use in their de-radicalization attempts or attempts to counter-radicalize. But really, why is that important for American policymakers? I would say that there's probably a dozen reasons why this is significant and why this has to be sort of front and center in our thinking about the current conflict with the extremists. But I'm just going to narrow it down to about 6. The first and most important is we will not understand the actual war that's going on unless we understand the appeal that's being made by the extremists and what they claim is motivating them. That's the first and most important thing. The second reason is we're going to fail to win over ordinary Muslims if we fail to take into consideration the appeal to Islam that's being made by these extremists. They are using very technical, very deeply grounded religious language in the appeals they're making to ordinary Muslims. They're not making kind of superficial arguments. They can be deeply troubling for ordinary Muslims who want to engage with those who would argue with them and show why this is wrong. Why, for instance, the caliphate should not have been created. Why their vision of life in a caliphate is wrong. So we're going to fail to win over ordinary Muslims as well if we, as some policymakers as well as some experts in the region, have failed to make a clear distinction between the extremists and ordinary Muslims and have tried to argue that, in fact, the extremists are somehow reflecting true Islam or more authentically expressing Islam. So that's deeply offensive to most people in the region and to most Muslims. And if we don't have an answer for that, if we don't have a way of arguing with that sort of language that's being used by some experts, I think we're going to fail to win over ordinary Muslims to our side. So I think there's a bigger point here as well. By understanding the war, we're going to see the war from the viewpoint of the extremists. And the extremists understand this war as an existential fight. They do not see it as a war of choice, something you can engage in and then withdraw from, something that you can, one day say is, all important for our country, and the next minute it's like, what's going on in Afghanistan right now? They think it's an existential fight, and this means that they will do anything. They'll use any means, and they'll pay any price to win. Many of them have given their lives in order to win this war, right? And can we say the same about ourselves? That we understand this is an existential fight, that we understand this is something we'd be willing to pay any price in order to win. That means that there's an extraordinary asymmetry between us and our opponents. And until we understand them deeply and see where they're coming from and why they're doing what they're doing, I do not believe we can engage with them in the way that is necessary to actually beat them and win this war. Thank you.
Mary, fantastic summary, thank you. And I would encourage everyone who may not have read it yet to read Mary's paper on the Heritage website, Identifying and Isolating Jihadi-Salafists Through Their Ideology, Practices and Methodology. Hassan, over to you for your thoughts.
Sure, yeah. So I have to say, this is probably one of the first papers and framing of the subject, which I've been working on for a while, that is so accurate and kind of gets the nuance of the debate, because it's a delicate subject that as I found as I started moving out of the region into London and then came here, I started to understand how it could be problematic, because to me, I think the debate, again, personally, was easier to have in the region than here, for obvious reasons. In the region, you could say things and people understand that you're talking about a very specific ideology within the broader environment and landscape. Outside, sometimes when you say what's accurate and right, there is an effect to that might be interpreted by some people as implicating ordinary Muslims who, the majority of reject these ideas, and even within conflict zones. No, we're not talking about stable countries. We're talking about war-torn countries. Not only that, but rebel forces who are involved in violence who reject these ideas, despite extreme circumstances within those. So, as long as you understand this is a very specific, subject, you start to miss. There's some problems there. But once you understand this is a very specific ideology within a broader context, a very narrow one, then I think you also have to acknowledge at the same time that this is a problem. And this is a problem that has a religious dimension and that has to be tackled through religious language at the same time. So as long as you kind of maintain that balance, I think it's a nuanced, very nuanced argument and a very useful one, very practical. So I'll touch on this some of the points you make. I really liked how you framed it, and try to maybe use the Syrian and Iraqi context to see how this ideology, this particular narrow ideology, is practiced on the ground. Because one thing is to understand what it is. And I think you laid it out very clearly, like the hybrid ideology between Salafism, traditionalism, and Islamism. And the hybrid, or the hybridization, comes from this thing, from mixing revolutionary ideas of political Islam with fundamentalist, rigid ideas of traditional Islam. Without that mix, you won't have the same problem that we have with Salafi jihadism. In fact, both political Islam and Salafism include some safeguards against what we know as Salafi jihadism, if they stay clear and pure on their own path, intellectual basis, rather than mix and marry with the hybrid. But also to go back to the question of why do they hate us. Also, something I noted back when ISIS came to prominence in 2014. I was in the region at the time, and I remember the reactions in the region, especially in the early months. That was really an interesting, useful kind of period to really go back to study, because After that, it became a blame game. But in the early weeks and months when people in the region were watching and seeing how ISIS what ISIS was doing and how it was doing things, and see the reactions for it. So the difference was after 9/11. People, the question of why do they hate us? What's the problem? What's going on here? Was coming from outside the region and was asked at Muslims rather than it was a genuine conversation. At least that's a perception from our region back in the day. But the question after the rise of ISIS was really an inter-Muslim question, especially in the early days again. When Muslims across the region, probably because of social media, because of the liberalization of some of the media there, people start asking questions, where is this problem coming from? We have a problem. So that was a recognition across the region where people recognized there was a problem with some of the traditions that the extremists use and their interpretation of them. And I think that was a genuine moment. It was an interesting moment that was not seized. And unfortunately, quickly after that, countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and others start to blame each other and turn it against each other in political blame game, rather than a genuine conversation that should have been continued and seized, going back to the roots. And I think there's a byproduct of that there are still intellectuals now who have powerful shows on YouTube, on some media, who are becoming more outspoken about some particular problems that provided the intellectual basis for those who created who introduced Salafi jihadism at some point. So Salafi jihadism, as you mentioned, it's an intellectual, it does have what I call theological corridor into early Islam. But it's a very zigzag sort of corridor where they go from one thing and climb to another cleric, and from that cleric they move to another one. So that's a very picky thing, but it's rooted in some of the traditions rather than mainstream, a very straight line from there. So as you mentioned, Ibn Taymiyyah is a really intriguing person. Like I was introduced to him first year of university during one summer vacation when I had to rent with some Sharia students at the time. It was the first time I heard about him and his legacy and people like Sayyid Qutb and Muhammad Qutb at the time. And I still have I kind of respect him as an intellectual because he was the first, in my opinion, he is the first modern intellectual. A religious intellectual within Islam. His methodology, the way he approached the text, he approached religion was very modern methodology. So he approached it from that idea that I can approach the text and deal with it as a person, rather than use the complex tradition way of, trying to compare context and see what's the context of that text. No, I can directly go to it and so. And interestingly, Ibn Taymiyyah comes right in the middle of Islamic history. So he comes from exactly almost the middle of early Islam and present Islam. So he's that kind of middle way. And much of Salafi jihadism is really the legacy of his ideas, and then the ideas of Ibn Hanbal or the Hanbali thought, and the students of Ibn Hanbal, which all were interpreted by Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab in Saudi Arabia, or before Saudi Arabia was formed. And then from that legacy, some people took some of these ideas of Wahhabism, what we know as Wahhabism, and mixed it with the modern phenomenon of political Islam that comes from first from Hassan al-Banna and other legacies in India and Pakistan, with Sayyid Qutb, who made it more extreme, and then Muhammad Qutb was the first to kind of link between the two. So I just kind of give you a concrete example. So Muhammad Qutb, Ibn Taymiyyah, let's say, Ibn Taymiyyah, the early cleric, came up with an idea that was an original thought for him, a thesis, which was that for you to adhere to the true tawheed, the true monotheism of God, that to believe in the oneness of God, you have to adhere to three criteria. within that. So, because he says pre-Islamic Arabs used to believe in God, but that's not enough. You have to believe in God, and then you have to believe only in God. You can't believe in another thing, associate anything with him, to kind of abide by the Tawheed idea. And then you have to have very specific features of the creed, so what God is and what God is not, and so on and so forth. So these three criteria were, Muhammad Qutb later on added another criterion to it, but it's something that he took from his brother Sayyid Qutb, which is the Hakimiyya, which is the only God rule, and the rule of God, and that you cannot implement anything that's not ruled and decreed by God. And that Muslims have to live under the rule of God in that sense. So he took that idea and he added it and called it Hakimiyyat, Tawheed al-Hakimiyya. So he added a fourth criterion to Ibn Taymiyyah's three criteria and called it Tawheed al-Hakimiyya, means the oneness, that in order to believe in one God, you have to also believe that only his rule, you have to live by his rule, basically. And that's really, a lot of people now, beyond even Salafi jihadism, believe that that fourth criteria is mainstream somehow. So that's the danger of seeing even Salafi jihadism as a very monolithic, because it's really a salad of, like, it's a combination of different things. Because within Salafism, Salafism is an intellectual framework that also you have to differentiate between Salafi jihadism and al-Qaeda and ISIS, because al-Qaeda and ISIS are very specific jihadi Salafi, or Salafi jihadis, whatever you call them, that really implemented, so they applied Salafi jihadism in that sense, within a broader context. So within Salafi jihadism, we have different schools. They have, like, for example, a Syrian cleric who had a fallout with the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood. He was a Muslim Brotherhood leader, and then he traveled to Saudi Arabia. He was a math teacher, so he settled in northern Saudi Arabia, I imagine, I reckon, and there he started to be influenced by Salafism, but also his disciples, his Salafi disciples, started to also be influenced by his Muslim Brotherhood background, the Islam thing. So he created a movement that we call today Sururism. Muhammad Surur, Zain al-Abidin. Sururism is a very influential one, but Salafi jihadis use it as a slur word, even though it could be considered as part of that Sahwa legacy. The Islamic awakening in 1979 and before and after. So even within that legacy, you have that diverse sort of things. But it's a very specific, it's a very modern approach to Islam that approaches the text in a way like that's modern. That's why kind of just want to add one thing, because I do agree with all what you said. So I just kind of wanted to add some aspect to reinforce your argument. So usually I ask questions when I speak to military people, for example, or other diplomats and others, is to ask this question. But after understanding all this different complexity, is what's one's problem with ISIS? Obviously, there are different problems, diverse problems. But in order to defeat this ideology, you have to know the specifics of this ideology, and then understand that you have to isolate the different aspects and then defeat them and approach them differently, because you can't have one approach to them. You have to have different approaches. So is the problem with ISIS the cutting hands of thieves or the stoning of women, adulterers, and so on and so forth, according to their ideology? That's obviously a problem for many, but that's a problem separate from suicide bombing? Is your problem then political violence and the use of graphic, gory pictures and so on and so forth? Because if that's the problem, then you're talking about something else. You're talking about not traditional Islam. So if your problem, just to kind of make it clear, if the problem is the cutting hands of thieves and the implementation of these hudud, penal code, then your problems start to become more with traditional Islam. And I think everyone recognizes in the region that we need to go and revise and study how we can move away from what Saudi Arabia and Iran and others are doing and kind of implementing these gory, old-fashioned sort of penal code that no longer should no longer have a place in our modern society. That's a conversation that is a purely Muslim conversation. It has to be dealt with, and it's a serious problem. And it's not something, a subject for us in DC and elsewhere. It's actually something that Muslims and Muslim clerics in mainstream places talk about, but they have to tread carefully, obviously, because that borders apostasy when you talk about how just ignore them. And then if your problem, the other problem, which I think is bigger and affects more people, is the political violence, the sectarianism, sectarian violence, political sectarian violence, the suicide bombing. Then your problem then with political Islam, with groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and others and so on and so forth. But it shouldn't be approached in the same way. You can't just ban them, for example, or something like that. It has to be a different, nuanced approach that's more holistic, but you have to start with understanding that it is contributor to the problem. You can't just say they say, oh, we're peaceful. It's like the difference between a hate speech, a preacher who says, I'm not involved in violence, but I say these things, it's my freedom of speech, and then one of my followers go and kill someone else because he heard me something or interpreted in a different way. You can't blame me for my follower, the worshiper who attended that mosque. No, there is that link. You have to understand that the preacher is part of the problem rather than a separate issue. Unfortunately, many people don't like that idea because they think it's a very extreme right-wing sort of idea, right? Or an Egyptian idea or something, like they associated with extreme approach. But it's not. You don't have to kill them. You don't have to imprison. You have to recognize first it's a threat, and then we can talk about how to deal with that threat. But you have to understand that it's a threat. It's part of the problem. And I'll give you an example just to go back to one last point to make of how Salafi jihadism is a modern or modernist in terms of modernist ideology in terms of approach, and what's the link between that and suicide bombing. So I give you, again, for me, if you have like mainstream established religious establishments like Al-Azhar institution in Egypt, or say even established Salafi organizations in say Syria, Iraq, or in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, the mainstream sort of say linked to the government. They're usually resistant to change, because they're opposed to both liberal Islam, progressive Islam, and to extremism at the same time. They don't like these two. And my argument is always that the progressive Islam or progressive clerics or Muslims are progressive, but they are religious, and extremists and hardliners and jihadis, they actually have more in common with each other than the extremists have with the mainstream religious establishments. In terms of approach and methodology, the methodology of the progressives is actually very similar to the methodology of the jihadists. They use the same methodology to approach the text. The difference is that one uses it for violence and one uses it for modernity and progress and so on, progressiveness and so on and so forth. So I give you one example to that. One last point is Yusuf al-Qaradawi. He's kind of considered the spiritual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood. So for 95%, probably 99% of his views are very progressive. They're modernists. They say Muslim women could take off the hijab if they need to, and so on and so forth. He has fatwas that are more permissive, allow people to do things than prevents them from saying things. So he's known to be a modern progressive cleric, but he, unlike the Salafists, says it's okay to blow up yourself in suicide bombing to kill Israelis in the beginning, and then he said that expanded it to Syria as well. So how do you reconcile? A lot of people say that's an aberration of his views, but in my opinion, it's actually very coherent with his methodology. The same reasons that allowed him to say it's okay for a Muslim woman, for example, to take off the hijab, is the same. It relates to the same methodology that allows him to say it's okay for you to kill yourself for something, because he based his ideas on pragmatism, on this idea that we can approach the text, and the text is here to make people happy and make people prosper as long as they abide by the essentials of being a Muslim as an identity. So I think it makes perfect sense for someone to say this and say this, rather than for a Salafi to say this and say. So a Salafi would, without an exception, all Salafis who are truly Salafis say suicide bombing is forbidden, because they say the text says you cannot kill yourself. The hadith says it very clearly, so how can you jump before that? So Yusuf al-Qaradawi says, yeah, the text says that, but the psychology of someone who commits suicide because he's depressed is a different psychology to someone. The psyche is different from someone who kills himself in battle. He says, because I understand it's different. This is a different situation from this. He just issues a fatwa based on his own interpretation of the text, rather than goes to the literal part of the text and say, no, the hadith says you cannot kill yourself, because if you kill yourself, you'll roll in hell for eternity, as the text says it. So, kind of end with that. Hopefully that's clear.
Fantastic, really fantastic. Thank you, Hassan. Before we get into the Q&A, and there's a lot of questions. I mean, there are really a lot of questions that those presentations throw up. I'll kick off. You guys have just laid out this incredibly complex, intricate, nuanced understanding of ideology, of faith, different understandings of a particular faith, and all the variations within that. I think there's one thing that you could say that it's not easy for leaders on the world stage to do sometimes. It's to translate complex, intricate, and nuanced thought into sound bites that are digestible to the average voter, right? Your average American, your average Brit, whoever it may be. All the post 9/11 presidents, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and now Donald Trump, have all taken kind of, well, I think quite pronounced different approaches as to how they discuss this issue, which has been obviously a bigger issue at various times throughout the 9/11 period. But I don't think it's ever been that far from the mind of people in the US. I mean, terrorism remains a key issue, and this area remains a key one people are interested in. So if you were to give any advice to leaders who have to talk about this issue on the world stage, I mean, where on earth do you start? I mean, what is the way into this?
You will go.
So one of the purposes of the paper is, to have a conversation not just with policymakers, but with ordinary Americans as well. Because in my opinion, the biggest challenge that we've been facing is that most leaders of the American government have punted on this issue because they feel uncomfortable talking about it. They don't think that they know enough to be able to have a conversation knowledgeably about these intricacies. And so they're using very sort of simple kind of frameworks. Either it has nothing to do with Islam at all. I remember very clearly George Bush saying right from the start, this has nothing to do with Islam. Islam is a peaceful religion, a religion of peace. And basically, we're not going to talk about Islam. And although that changed, he had great difficulty understanding what he was dealing with because the experts were all over the place. So we'd have one expert come in and say, yeah, you should use the term Islamofascism, you know, or you should, use the term radical Islam, or you should use, there were, a dozen experts had a dozen different propositions for him. And usually presidents are not expert on anything more than one or two issues, right? And they leave everything else to the experts. And in this case, the experts were, it was impossible to come to a consensus about what he was probably being told. So he tried a little bit of, let's talk about Islamofascism, let's talk about radical Islam, let's talk about violent extremism, and then kind of gave up on it. And so the message that came across to ordinary Americans was the government is covering up what's really going on here, or something like that. And there's something more going on. After all the people who are carrying out these attacks say that they're Muslim and that they're doing it because they're Muslim and for Islam. So there were a lot of Americans then who were open to, those experts who were saying things like, this is all about Islam, or these guys represent the most authentic version of Islam, and what they're doing is what, all Muslims would really like to be doing, or something like that. Right? So I thought right from the start that the problem was a problem of just knowledge, of people not knowing enough about the topic to be able to speak knowledgeably from the top to the American people. So it's not a matter of finding some kind of magic phrase. It's really a matter of just education. On the other hand, under Obama, the decision was made to excise religion entirely, and Islam was not even going to be part of the conversation. And that also was not very helpful because people were now making up their minds that, okay, there is something going on here, but the government doesn't even want to talk about it. And now they really cut it out of the conversation. That was a lot of people were saying that. So I feel that again was not very helpful, just to say it has zero. But you also saw when Donald Trump began to talk about this and was making a kind of broader sort of assertion about what we're dealing with here, that this was radical Islam, and radical Islam was apparently a lot of things, included Shia versions of Islam all the way over to, the Muslim Brotherhood, but other forms of Islamism as well. You got the sense that this is like this big thing, this broad thing. And there were a lot of people who said, that can't be right either. There's got to be some other explanation for what's going on here, because otherwise we'd be dealing with, millions of suicide bombings and millions of Muslims in our country are, rising up and engaging in violence, and they're not. So again, there's this kind of rejection of what the president's saying. And I think, again, it has to do with from the very top, an unclear message, and unclear because I think the president and his advisors themselves don't really have the background to be able to have these knowledgeable conversations with the American people.
Okay, Hassan, if you had any thoughts on that, and then we'll kick it open to you guys.
Sure. I mean, we all noticed that when President Trump said radical Islam, it just disappeared. We saw that at the time. But I think there is, so it's only half facetiously, I think there is value in saying, in recognizing, not saying it, but because it turned into kind of a polemics rather than anything else. But by recognizing what the problem is and where different groups and movements contribute to the problem, I think that's a very important starting point. I don't think we're there yet. Probably with this administration, we started to have it. The problem is for the wrong reasons. If it was done by people who really genuinely want to kind of help people on the ground, the moderates, to build something different, then I think it can go a long way. And we can kind of benefit from the post 9/11 campaign against the finances of extremism, because I think that campaign, which continued to say for a long time, but like for the 10 years after 9/11, when the Arab Spring started, I argue that the CT part of the campaign after 9/11, not the occupation of Iraq, not Afghanistan, not the wars, but the campaign, the CT campaign that followed, actually, in my opinion, saved the region from a greater jihadi takeover than what we saw in 2011, 12, 13, 14 in different parts of the country. You have to recognize that part was successful. The finances, going after preachers, knowing who's who, and so on and so forth. That really was effective. The sad reality is that the other problems also exaggerated the problems. But if you assume that history would have the same events, like the Arab Spring would have happened in the same way, then I'd imagine without the CT element of the post 9/11, I think the situation would be a lot bigger than what we saw over the past few years. And I think that concretely, again, I think what the U.S. should be doing is really to tighten the screws in the same way they did with the finance campaign, is to go after preachers, hate preachers, but not in the way that would help countries in the region to crack down. But because what we saw after 2014 is that some countries started building centers, but these centers are just token for show. They have it somewhere in someone's capital. It doesn't really do any real job, but it has a fancy name, and it's part of the global coalition. It's helping the global coalition, but it's not really doing anything. And instead, they should have done it with private individuals, with civil societies, and with the private sector. If these people, if that approach is done, I think you could go a long way, because on social media you find individuals. I know other people who don't get a dime for doing whatever they're doing, but they're so passionate about going after the extremists. Imagine if they support those that organize them, train them, and help them to say whatever they say. You have clerics who are under so much pressure to change their tone because it's no longer financially viable for them to continue on that path of criticizing extremism and so on and so forth. They won't be accepted in some media outlets, right? So by making it okay for someone to criticize extremism, comfortable, expertly done, I think there's a lot to be done there. But it shouldn't be government. That's why President Obama or Trump or others should not engage in these things, because they are presidents. That's not their job to say whether Islam is part of the problem or not. I think it's someone else's job.
Okay, thank you. Right, we've got about 10 minutes, I think. Why don't we start with a question, gentleman at the back.
Good afternoon. Thank you to the panel. My name is Araj Shatra. I'm an intern here at Heritage. So I just wanted to ask you about, Mr. Hassan, about how Washington diplomats should not be involved in sort of cultural matters, right? Because they're skirting with problems like blasphemy and other things like that. But what about international educational institutions, which serve as a megaphone for the world's worst human rights violators to not only cover up their own human rights abuses, but to slander and just totally lie about the only country in the Middle East that has any values that we would deem acceptable in a modern society. People at the UN are not diplomats. These people are working in an educational institution, and they're able to influence the hearts and minds of millions of people around the world. So if this kind of stuff is incentivized, why would any reformists have a chance in countries like Saudi Arabia? I want the crown prince of Saudi Arabia to succeed. I see him as a reformer, but he looks like he's under a tremendous amount of pressure, and he's not really able to maneuver because of the risk to, first, probably his life, but the whole society, because this is allowed to keep being shielded at the UN.
Who wants to, tough, interesting week to talk about Saudi Arabia.
No, what should I say?
Then I just be careful whatever you say.
So I just want to say in general, because I kind of disagree with the framing, especially the last part. But I do think that terrorism is used as a tool by governments to suppress and repress. That was something that was done before and after, and actually undermined the effort to and terrorism. Unfortunately, the way the U.S. Network of interest in the region is impeding that. That's why they don't speak about when they need to speak, and they speak when they don't need to speak, in matters related to human rights and so on and so forth. I think so. There are different ways of looking at the region, but the pessimistic one is that this region is heading to something much worse than we saw over the past few years. ISIS will be It doesn't have to be the same problem. ISIS, that's a kind of a paradigm that we saw over the past. It could be something more. Could be collapse of states and other things, right? It doesn't have to be violent Salafi jihadi organizations. Could be something destabilizing that's worse than what we saw over the past year. And I think the U.S. can. There's so many tools that the U.S. could do through. Things that they also have experience with, which training people to engage in these things on a local level. Civil society is an important thing, something the U.S. has neglected over the past in recent memory. They abandoned because they would have problems with Egypt, or they would have problems with Saudi Arabia, or they would have problems with other neighbors of Saudi Arabia. So that's kind of the vague part of it.
Thank you. And why don't we take... Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am.
Listen, can I just
Please.
Yeah. So I'd just like to follow up because I see that, as usual, I've sort of skipped a step. One of the purposes, as I said, of the paper is to act as a kind of educational tool for just ordinary Americans to get a little knowledge about this very difficult topic. But it's also obviously designed for policymakers to help them find some language to be able to talk about a very difficult topic. So the purpose of the paper is to make the argument that you don't need to talk about Islam, except to talk about ordinary Muslims as being the vast majority of Muslims out there. It's really to talk about the extremists so that they can place them for the American people where they deserve to be placed, as a cult. And I think that kind of language could be very helpful for policymakers. Use the term cult, to talk about how marginalized they are and how extreme their ideas are within the broader world of Islam. It opens up a conversation that I think actually the American people want to have. They want to know where are these guys coming from and why they're doing what they're doing. And people are sort of self-educating. They've been reading stuff in order to figure out what's going on. But the experts, as I said, are all over the place. So you basically can find somebody who says this is what Islam is about. And you can find people who say this has nothing to do with religion at all. It's all about economics and other sorts of issues. And this is to provide, I hope, some insight into the way that the extremists understand themselves and the way that most people in the region understand them, as this cult that needs to be marginalized and understood as attempting to actually hijack the entire religion and transform it through a new ijma into their image. So, I think that would be extremely helpful for the American people if, from the very top, they would hear this kind of language about these guys.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think we've got time for another couple of questions. We're at 2 o'clock. Why don't we take the three of them together, because I can see 3 people. So, sir on the front, and then 2 people on the 4th row back.
Thank you. My name is Ahmed. I'm a diplomat at the Embassy of Jordan, a country that is well known for its, efforts in countering terrorism. And I assume that everyone, should be aware about the efforts that we do, especially in the long-term, efforts to fight the ideological aspect of terrorism. Just to Hassan's point that it's an inter-Muslim, dialogue. We say in Jordan it's a civil war within Islam. I just want to, throw this, and I'm sure that you're aware, the Amman message and the interfaith dialogue initiatives that were established and kicked off in Jordan that shine a light on how to educate the world about modern Islam, about the true values of Islam. My question is, are these initiatives? Do you think that these initiatives took their, right to be well, circulated in the United States? Have they, impacted the public opinion?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Good. Thank you. Then there's a gentleman there, and then the lady next to him.
I'm Thomas Gorgisyan, a journalist and a writer. My question is, Dr. Habak, because you took us back 17 years and said you started with the state of mind of neglecting and then paying attention to what's going on. After 17 years of pushing the issue or trying to understand what's going on, it is, and you come to conclusion somehow at the end that still we are somewhere of nowhere. I mean, it's like, excuse me to say that. Do you think that what was missing, what is missing in general in these 17 years, that it's like, there is a lack of understanding or not readiness to understand? Somehow, this related question, because both of you mentioned somehow you are facing fighting terrorism or whatever in this cult way, whatever. And you are talking about talking to military people and policymakers. How you can, I mean, better understanding of this cult, how it helps military people to shoot them or not shoot them. You know, it's like, because at the end, you know, at the end, drones and other ways, means and are used instead of, I mean, they are not changing their mind, and we are not changing our policies anyway, more or less.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. And then I think yes, please.
Oh, sorry.
And I'll also take yours, sir, and I think we better do it. I think that better be at the end. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Deborah Weiss, and I'm actually a 9/11 survivor from New York. I'm having trouble formulating the question, but I'm just wondering, you keep talking about extremists and Muslims versus Islam, and from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you might be conflating people versus the ideas. I do understand that there are a lot of people who call themselves Muslims that eschew the violence, but that wouldn't necessarily mean that the ideology of Islam isn't a problem. And many people, including here, seems to be defining, quote, extremism as violence. But I would say that if you can't have free speech or you can't do the hudud punishments, I mean, you said that's part of Islam, and that seems extreme to me. And the final thing I'll just say is, since Muhammad, who's supposed to be the exemplary man, was a soldier and a warrior, I'm unclear on how you can leave that out of the equation when you're making the assessment.
Okay, and then sir, and okay, since it's the last one, we'll get you in as well. It's going to be 5 questions. They're all going to be quick answers.
I mean, terrific subject matter. Frankly, I wish we were going for another hour. And both of you summarized it, but what you did, in my view, was you added to the ongoing muddying of the waters. Dr. Habeck calls it a cult. Mr. Hassan, I think very correctly, brought up a fundamental point about the religious aspect and the religious aspect of the Muslim world needing to handle that element on its own. But I would actually like to have both of you comment on a fellow who's put forward a lot of really, I think, very relevant material, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. He's got a website. He's been very forthcoming in stating that the religion of Islam needs a reformation. And you talked about it, Mr. Hassan, and I think that Zuhdi's right, because I've read a bit of the Quran. I've read a little bit of the Hadith, a little bit of those other holy books. And when I see in the Quran, take neither Jews nor Christians as your friend, when I see in the Quran, slay the unbeliever wherever you find them, and then I read what Osama bin Laden, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi say, which is they are committing, it's the obligation of every Muslim to commit jihad in order to put forward Sharia law throughout the world. I have to ultimately believe what those guys are telling me, because they're telling me what's on their mind.
Great, thank you. And final last question, sir. I'm sorry to cut you off. We've got a lot to get through.
Sure. Well, my name is Rock, and I'm actually one of the co-founders of a Muslim tech startup, Young Muslims. My question is very simple and easy. Earlier we had spoken about how the world leaders are having a bit of a hard time grasping the idea and addressing the ideas of how to discuss political conversations and the conversation about about this topic and other topics. So my question is that if it is already hard enough for the world leaders to grasp this content, then what about for the average American like myself or anyone else? As in, so I guess the question is, should we kind of change the conversation, not having it with the policymakers, but having it with the average Americans via media outlets? So, if any follow-up questions do arise, they're more properly addressed, and then the policymakers, clearly who we can see are influenced by media, can approach it from there.
Got it. Okay, Mary, why don't you kick us off on any or all of which you wish to take on?
Boy, I get this is like several days worth of conversation.
Yeah,
But
that's
just very briefly on the last point you made, I don't think it's an either or. I think we need to be, everybody needs to be having this conversation. So I affirm and support what you're doing. I think I would love to hear more about it afterward if you wouldn't mind. So actually, the question of what's lacking in this effort, I think, is apparent from the conversation we're having here. There's a lack of common knowledge and common agreement about what we're dealing with, and you can see that. So the problem, I think, is also there's been a polarization of American elites and a polarization of the American people. We find ourselves here and here, and we hardly talk to each other anymore. And we choose, I know, I've got my list of websites that I read, and I know who the other guys are and what they're saying, but I don't want to read their things, right? And we're living in places where we don't even have to talk to people who are different from us, right? Because we've made our minds up in some ways about these issues, and it's very difficult even to have a conversation anymore in the U.S. So that's what's lacking is a common, and I've said this in other contexts, so just from a strategic viewpoint, the biggest problem, in my opinion, that the U.S. is facing is elite disagreement. So we have at least 3 or 4 elites in the United States who disagree profoundly on every single issue: economics, national security, America's place in the world, the military, you name it. They disagree profoundly with each other. And we've seen one take over and take us one direction, one take us a different direction, and there's at least a couple more elite groups out there. And the American people are trying them out one by one to see which one they think is helping our country. And, so to me, the biggest problem that we're facing is this. And each one of those elite groups has their own views about Islam and about the extremists. And they've been either having a conversation or not having a conversation based on those views. So the question of, isn't this really what Islam is all about? Islam is whatever Muslims say it is. There's a thing called ijma, the consensus of the community. My people will never agree on an error, Muhammad said. So you're talking about a religion that defines itself by what the majority say it is. This is what they're attempting to do, the extremists, is convince everybody that their version of Islam is the right way forward. They're going to take everybody off in that direction. And they're having that conversation every day. They're winning over recruits. They're attempting to shift the entire religion. So you talk about a reformation. Wasn't it Luther that wanted to take everybody back to the original founder? But was what Luther proposed actually what Jesus said? It was what Luther thought Jesus said. Yeah. So what's going on here is it's not the 7th century we're talking about, or even the 8th or 9th. They hate those centuries. The extremists hate those centuries. The Umayyads, they wish they'd all fall over dead. Oh, they did. They hate those guys. What they want is the 12th century. Everything was perfect. Everything was right. The 12th century is what they want to go back to. They don't want to go back to, actually, Muhammad? No. Seriously, no. So the point about this is that you could say this is the Reformation. Osama bin Laden et al., that's Luther, right? And the Saudi officials are sort of like the Pope coming to the U.S., who, by the way, are the Sultan of the Ottoman Caliphate, and saying, can you help us with our Luther problem? Well, obviously we can't. This is the problem of engagement. Obviously we can't. We can't engage on that, right? The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. But on the other hand, you know, very rich, powerful guy, maybe facilitate, help from behind the scenes, but also with his own people have the right kind of conversation about what we're actually dealing with here, right? Because Islam did go through its enlightenment, you know, in the late 19th, early 20th century, and there was a consensus, a new consensus, very modernist in its approach that developed. And that's what these guys hate, the new consensus that developed. You know, you can go back and you can take a look at Kabul University in the 1960s and 70s, girls in mini skirts, very modernist. Same thing was very true of Egypt. You can watch the transformation as it became a modernist university, the Cairo University, and then as the Islamists made an argument that, hey, all these modernist ideas have led to corruption, immorality, we've lost our values as a people, we need to go back to the 12th century. So the argument is this ongoing argument. One of the things that complicates it and makes it more difficult is many Muslims believe we tried modernism. We tried the Western way, and it led to corruption. It led to immorality. We lost our values as a people. So maybe we'll give these guys a chance.
San, any concluding remarks?
We actually leave it with that thought because I think she said it very well. I just want to emphasize that there is this. Oh, the mic. But I do think there is a civil war going on, and we have to recognize that since 1979, that's when the problem started. You know, some people misframe it as if there was no problem before that. But what I'm saying is that's when the evolution of modern revolutionary Islam, not Islam, it's a kind of one part of a big picture that's been affecting both Shia Islam and Sunni Islam. It's not just you know, with the Khomeini revolution, with the siege of Mecca, with the rise of Salafi jihadism, with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. You know, there are several major factors that happened in that year, 1979, and then that's when something started that was new, that was modern, that was you know, new in that sense. But it's a dot in a big picture. I am one of those very few who say there is a problem there, because that problem is framed in religious language. And if it's left without dealing with addressing it head on, it will have an erosive and corrosive effect on the bigger picture, because they are making an argument that could develop and evolve into something bigger and bigger and bigger. And we've seen it becoming bigger since 1979. It's now bigger than it was since then. Things emerged out of it. Al-Qaeda and ISIS emerged out of that. But again, I want to emphasize that it's a very specific, very narrow trend, but it's a destructive trend that all of us have a stake in kind of dealing with it in a more composed, not like in a way that's combative. But all of us have a stake in kind of reducing that because even you know, I studied ISIS very closely, I interviewed them and so on and so forth. Even within ISIS, the religious factor, in my opinion, that leads people to join ISIS is only 20-30% of what lead people to join ISIS. So imagine that. That's very specific. ISIS is a minority within the terrorist sort of part within Salafi jihadism that's bigger than both the terrorism and ISIS. And then bigger than that is the Salafism and the political Islam, and then the real Islam, which is a lot bigger than that. So what I'm saying is just to emphasize that it's a very particular problem. Every time you go closer and zoom in, it's a very narrow, very specific problem, but it's a problem.
Well, I think we'd all agree it was a real privilege and a pleasure to be in the presence of two such genuine experts on this subject. I thought it was a fantastic conversation. Thank you for all coming, and please thank Hassan and thank Mary.
That was great.